Hello, friends. Good morning. So glad that you're with us, and we are here for another installment in the book of James. We're in James chapter 5 now, and so we're getting really close to finishing up this book. Still looking for some suggestions on where to go next. I'm mulling over a couple ideas in my head. I never thought it would get to this point where I would be looking at a third book to go into, but really have enjoyed doing these with you all. I've learned a lot. I hope certainly you have as well. Admittedly, this is a trickier passage for me as I was diving into it, these first 6 verses in James chapter 5. And I think you'll understand as we go through that why that's the case. But the good thing is, as poring over God's word has done yet again, it has forced me to wrestle with a text maybe I wouldn't normally deal with, and to unpack those truths, to exegete that text, to understand it better, and then now to have the privilege to share with you is a great blessing. So let's look at it together. James 5, 1 through 6, and we'll talk about it. It says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you." So as I said, if you've been following along with us through James, you notice that there are times where he's not only encouraging the brethren there, but he also is trying to challenge them, and he's giving them several tests as to whether their faith is genuine. You know, we talk a lot about the whole faith and works issue in James chapter 2. In James 4, as we just finished up, there's a few other tests here, specifically around self-centered behavior and those behaviors that are contrary to the gospel. And so now we get to James 5, and in these first 6 verses, we are reading the most scathing rebuke in the entire epistle of James. Now, here he offers yet another test, and it's a strongly worded rebuke against those that are claiming to be followers of Christ, but apparently it seems that they're more in love with their wealth and with their affluence than they are with the gospel. And in fact, some have even argued that in this passage, James isn't even talking to Christians at all. He's actually talking to non-Christians, as opposed to the brethren aspects of his earlier parts in the text. Now, while I do believe he has unbelievers in mind, let's remember the context of this passage. This is a letter that's being written to a group of fellow believers. It'd be a little odd if all of a sudden he just, zooms off into this other direction and quickly offers, this different sideline to a different audience. So a better understanding might be that in writing this letter, he knows that there are going to be pretenders in the church. He understands that not everybody who claims to be a follower of Christ truly is. And so he's intending for this letter to be read aloud to the churches that it's being passed around to. And he knows full well, just to verify it, go back to James chapter 2, the whole faith versus works thing. And he knows that there are people who would be claiming to know Christ, but truly are not one of his. And so I believe that this is partly why he writes these things in chapter 5. He's writing it in this manner because as these people are pretending, he is rebuking them openly in this letter and saying, listen, judgment is coming. Now, it seems like this would be a hard passage to make application from, but as we'll get to at the end, there are some very significant applications for us. But the immediate application is this. While he may be rebuking these rich fakers that are in the church, the warning is going to be just as true for us as believers. And James, if you trace his passion, if you trace his heart, the angst that he's experiencing throughout this book, he does not want anyone to fall into sin, let alone grieve his sins. And so he's warning people. He's saying, this is not the way we're supposed to act. You're doing this, and this is going on, and so forth. So that's part of what he's saying throughout this epistle. So out of love, he is warning these people. When he rebukes, like he does so sternly here in chapter 5, it's out of love. So a love and a pursuit of wealth, oppositely, over Christ, that's an equally applicable for us as well. No matter what our status is in life, socioeconomically, we can still heed that same warning. So let's look at these verses. The first verse says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you." Now, while this sounds like he's trying to call them to repentance, that's not what James is saying here to his audience. This is rather a warning of impending doom and judgment. To the rich, he's saying, weep and howl, which are these outward actions of desperate, inconsolable grief. But why are they supposed to weep and howl? Well, it's because there are miseries, as James says, that are coming upon them. And that word miseries appears here in only one other place in the New Testament, and that's in Romans 3:16. As one commentary states, this is defining overwhelming trouble, suffering, hardship, and distress. This is a big deal. This is not, hey, you need to repent. This is, judgment is coming. You should be in this inconsolable grief, knowing that this judgment is coming. And then you look at verse 2. He says, your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver, verse 3, have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and then will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. So now notice here, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, okay? In these next 5 verses, he's going to lay out 4 different reasons why these rich pretenders are going to face God's wrath and judgment. He doesn't condemn them and say, okay, this is what's going to happen, sorry for your luck. He's going to outline the reasons why, make it very clear where they have disregarded God's authority and God's commands. And so in verses 2 through 3, we have the first one. He's explaining how one of the reasons they're going to face God's wrath and judgment is because they've been hoarding the wealth that they've been so eager to gain. They have so much wealth, whether it's their designer clothes or whatever else, that frankly, the wealth that they've accumulated in different commodities is going to waste. A lot of it is going to waste. They have so much wealth, they don't know what to do with it. And so it goes to waste. In context, we're saying here, your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Garments were a symbol of status. And they've got so many changes of clothes that the insects are getting to them. It's not so much about the fact that they have wealth, it's what they're doing with it. And for them, they've got so much of it, they've hoarded so much of it that it's now going to waste. And very likely, he's not just referring to clothing, but he's referring to other things, whether it's food or other resources that they have at their disposal. But they've gathered all these resources. Think of food. They may have so much food that then some of it's going to waste, or a lot of it's going to waste because they don't have the time in the day to eat it all. Why keep all that to themselves and not share it with others? So it could be food, it could be certain desired goods. Clothing, obviously, hence the point about the garments being moth-eaten. But all this fancy stuff, all this stuff that show their socioeconomic status, they likely had all of this in just great abundance. And it's going bad because they're not even able to use it all. And the misuse of these resources are the very evidences that James is pointing out to them. Your gold and silver have corroded. Their own physical money is corroding because obviously it wasn't minted the same way as it was today. Very likely it had some kind of alloys and other metals inside of it with the gold and silver. It wasn't quite as pure as what ours might be today. And so, there's rust and corrosion that can develop even on their money. They had so much of it that's what was happening. It wasn't being handled often enough that, you're thinking, how is that even possible? But yet here it is going on right here in James chapter 5. They're so affluent. They're so, well off. that things are going to waste. And these things that James is pointing out, that's what's condemning them. They're the very evidences that are condemning them, and that judgment time is coming. And as James points out, they're laying up treasure in the last days. We're talking about between the first and the second coming of Christ. We've been living in the last days since Christ went back to heaven. And this is a stern warning to them that not only hell awaits those who pretend to be followers of Christ, as they're in bed with worldly pleasures like these rich people are, but this is a serious matter. And James is saying, this is what you're facing because of this. Then we look at verse 4. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. So here's a second reason why James is condemning them, why James is saying judgment is coming, because the wealth that these people have gained was collected in less than reputable ways. For one, he points out in verse 4, they've withheld money from those who have labored for them. Now, in context, culturally speaking, day laborers were paid the day they worked. You work for the day, at the end of the day, you get paid for that day. This is literally where the whole hand-to-mouth concept comes from. They work, they get paid. It wasn't like, whether you get paid once a week or once a month or every other week kind of thing, like we do in modern times. It didn't work that way. You worked that day, you got paid that day, because they had immediate needs. They needed to go buy food and other necessities for themselves, and that's how it happened. They just literally lived on everything they made from day to day. And James is saying that these people have been fraudulent with their workers, with the people that they have hired to do work for them. So understand that, and then look at the verse again. These people would work all day and in the evening so they can buy the things that they need, and then either they're withholding that person's daily pay, or they're garnering something out of it and not giving them what they deserve for the work that they've done. Whichever one is true, they are manipulating, they're taking advantage of the people that they have hired, and they are doing it so that they can be more well off. That's the issue here at hand. And James is saying that the money that they're withholding, it testifies and it cries out against them as a witness of their evil acts. More so, the lament of the laborers themselves has reached the Lord. But notice that he doesn't just say it's reached the Lord. It's reached the Lord of hosts, which is the same word that we have Lord Sabaoth, his name, which you might hear in earlier translations of A Mighty Fortress is Our God. We use the word Lord of hosts in the way we sing that song because they mean the same thing, and it's a more modern understanding of that term. But that's what Martin Luther was going for when he wrote that. That translation there, it's not just a cute little phrase to describe God, Lord of hosts, okay, that's cool. No, but literally it's portraying God as the leader of all the heavenly hosts and armies. The God who is quick to judge. He is the rightful judge. He is the leader of all of the heavenly hosts. He is fully aware of the harm and evil that these people are doing and committing against their neighbors. That should wake anybody up. It's not just, hey, Jesus sees you. It's the God of all heavenly hosts sees what you are doing, and judgment is coming. That's what I'm saying here. This is a very strongly worded rebuke to these people. This is the sternest warning and rebuke in the entire epistle. But that's the second reason why they're facing judgment. They're not just hoarding it. They are taking advantage of other people in order to gain more wealth. And then look at verse 5. You've lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. So now the third reason here is God's judgment is coming upon them by how they spend their wealth on themselves. Of course, that's, kind of an implied thing, but James points this out very clearly. Look, you've hoarded more than what's reasonable or necessary. You've extorted your neighbors in order to get it. And now, worse yet, you're spending it only on yourself so that you can live comfortable and have pleasure. So their only goal in life is to please themselves. They are determined to make this life as comfortable for them as possible. And James just illustrates this by saying, hey, look, you know what? You have fattened yourselves, their hearts specifically. Your hearts have been fattened, as he's relating this to a way people would raise animals like pigs or so forth, fattening them up so that there'd be more meat, more on the animal when it's slaughtered. And James says that's all you're doing for yourself. You're just fattening yourselves up, and the day of slaughter is coming. The day of judgment is quickly approaching. And interestingly enough, that's why he uses that phrase, this day of slaughter. I mean, to put it bluntly, James is literally telling them, you are acting like fat pigs, living in the moment only for yourself, enjoying the pleasure because it makes you feel good, and yet you are being carted off to slaughter. There is eternal judgment from God that is coming, and you don't act like you care. Yet apparently these people either don't know, they don't fully understand, or as I said a moment ago, they just don't care. It's hard to know which one it is. But if you look at verse 6, you have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. Here's the fourth reason, which I feel like is the worst one of all. The last of the four reasons why they're going to face judgment. They've hoarded, they've extorted, they have, spent it all on themselves, and now worse yet, their desire for wealth has so consumed their thinking and living. Not only do they exploit it out of those less fortunate than them, they will go so far as to kill to make sure that they can maintain their lifestyle of the rich and famous. There's my Robin Leach plug for those of you that even remember who he is. The words condemned and murdered imply that these people are taking advantage of the judicial system so that they can kill off those who are opposed to them or those that are getting in their way. If you're getting in my way of being opulent and having all these things at my disposal, then let's get rid of them. So I believe there's an implication here that there's a low view of human life in regard to their personal pleasure and freedom. We know the justice system is supposed to be impartial and fair, yet there are bribes and extortion and blackmail that continues to run rampant. If you disagree, just go visit a third world country and tell me it doesn't exist. I saw plenty of that in Uganda. Even closer to home, try explaining all the corruption that we see in our own government today. The rich taking advantage of others and smiling while they do it. And I'm not saying that because I'm trying to make a political statement. Don't misunderstand me. That is not what I'm trying to say at all. It's an observation that government altogether has become infiltrated by sin. And it goes far beyond at times what its intended purposes are. And it's been corrupted in its thinking and in its actions. And James is ascribing this here to these rich people. He does not resist you. It's an interesting thing to close out that pericope with. But it likely indicates that the Christians who were being defrauded by these greedy individuals were acting humbly and trusted in God's protection and promises as they were being taken advantage of and harmed. Essentially, they're fulfilling Matthew 5, verses 39 through 42. I encourage you to look at those verses later when you get a chance. And they're by not resisting their oppressors. But let's conclude all of this scathing rebuke, this impending doom that's coming on these people. And now we've got to ask ourselves, so what? What is this lesson all about? Chris, you said that this is applicable for us today, so please help me understand why this is here or how I can use this passage in my own life. So let me give you some implications here. As we have read over these 6 verses, as James has heatedly condemned the attitude and the heart behind these wealthy people in the church, how do we apply this to ourselves? Let me venture to say that everyone listening or watching this does not feel like they fall into this category. I doubt anyone's watching this going, oh yeah, I'm rich. Yeah, I'm well off. Yeah, I don't want to do those things, but more than likely we're all kind of feeling middle of the road there a little bit. But the application still rings true, because the issue isn't the amount of money that we have or the amount of wealth that we've accumulated. The issue is, what are we doing with what we have? We can still act in these same four ways even if we make very little. So what do we do with that? Can we not still take advantage of other people in order to gain what we want to get? So listen, you may have a few dollars, you may have hundreds of thousands of dollars, but the truth is, we can hoard equally. We cannot use our resources wisely. We can manipulate, we can defraud other people in order to acquire our own wealth deceptively. We can abuse the court system if we want to and try to take advantage of other people. We can spend everything we get on ourselves. Rich or poor, we can all act this way. We are all capable of being like this. And so the question is for us this morning, are we laying everything we have down at the feet of Christ and saying, God, it's all of yours anyway. I'm just a steward. So show me what you want me to do with what you've given me. Listen, being rich is not a sin. Having wealth is not a sin. These are not the bad things. It's what are we doing with it? The question we need to ask ourselves, regardless of what our socioeconomic status is, regardless of how little or how much money we make, we need to ask ourselves, how are we helping to elevate the gospel with what we have? I'm not saying give it all away, but what I am saying is, are we glorifying God with what's been given to us? These are good things to ponder for us as we're getting ready to dive into our next topic, which, interestingly enough, our next topic is not anything new, but is a reiteration in some degree of what James previously talked about in James 1, about having patience while dealing with trials. So James is coming full circle back to something he said before. And I hope you'll join me as we get to study that together, as we get a little bit closer to the end of our study in James. And I'll look forward to seeing you next time.